My first reading lesson. This tells how he himself became an intelligent student. It was probably written while he was studying the schools of Saxony. These were the models for America so that the present educational system. Here is along the lines he advocated. As a child he had written a poem. By education the fatherland gains in splendor. I remember the time when I had not seen any other river than the one near my town. It was as clear as crystal, and joyous, too, as it ran on its course. But it was shaded by bamboos whose boughs bent to every breeze as if always complaining. That was my only world. It was bounded at the back by the blue mountains of my province. It was bounded in front by the white surface of the lake. The lake was as smooth as a mirror. Graceful sails were to be seen everywhere on it. At that age, stories pleased me greatly and, with all my soul, I believed whatever was in the books. There were good reasons why I should. My parents told me to be very careful of my books. They urged me to read and understand them. But they punished me for the least lie. My first recollection of reciting my letters reaches back to my babyhood. I must have been very little then, for when they rubbed the floor of our house with banana leaves I almost fell down. I slipped on the polished surface as beginners in skating do on ice. It took great effort for me to climb into a chair. I went downstairs step by step. I clung to each round of the baluster. In our house, as in all others in the town, kerosene oil was unknown. I had never seen a lamp in our town, nor a carriage on our streets. Yet, I thought Calamba was a very gay and lively town. One night, all the family, except my mother and myself, went to bed early. Why, I do not know, but we two remained sitting alone. The candles had already been put out. They had been blown out in their globes by means of a curved tube of tin. That tube seemed to me the finest and most wonderful plaything in the world. The room was dimly lighted by a single light of coconut oil. In all Filipino homes such a light burns through the night. It goes out just at daybreak to awaken people by its spluttering. My mother was teaching me to read in a Spanish reader called the Children's Friend. This was quite a rare book and an old copy. It had lost its cover and my sister had cleverly made a new one. She had fastened a sheet of thick blue paper over the back and then covered it with a piece of cloth. This night my mother became impatient with hearing me read so poorly. I did not understand Spanish and so I could not read with expression. She took the book from me. First she scolded me for drawing funny pictures on its pages. Then she told me to listen and she began to read. When her sight was good, she read very well. She could recite well, and she understood verse making, too. Many times during Christmas vacations, my mother corrected my poetical compositions, and she always made valuable criticisms. I listened to her, full of childish enthusiasm. I marveled at the nice-sounding phrases which she read from those same pages. The phrases she read so easily stopped me at every breath. Perhaps I grew tired of listening to sounds that had no meaning for me. Perhaps I lacked self-control. Anyway, I paid little attention to the reading. I was watching the cheerful flame. About it, some little moths were circling in playful flights. By chance, too, I yawned. My mother soon noticed that I was not interested. She stopped reading. Then she said to me, I am going to read you a very pretty story. Now pay attention. On hearing the word story I at once opened my eyes wide. The word Story promised something new and wonderful. I watched my mother, while she turned the leaves of the book, as if she were looking for something. Then I settled down to listen. I was full of curiosity and wonder. I had never even dreamed that there were stories in the old book which I read without understanding. My mother began to read me the fable of the young moth and the old one. She translated it into Tagalog a little at a time. My attention increased from the first sentence. I looked toward the light and fixed my gaze on the moths which were circling around it. The story could not have been better timed. My mother repeated the warning of the old moth. She dwelt upon it and directed it to me. I heard her. But it is a curious thing that the light seemed to me each time more beautiful, the flame more attractive. I really envied the fortune of the insects. They frolicked so joyously in its enchanting splendor, that the ones which had fallen and been drowned in the oil did not cause me any dread. My mother kept on reading and I listened breathlessly. The fate of the two insects interested me greatly. The flame rolled its golden tongue to one side and a moth which this movement had singed fell into the oil, fluttered for a time and then became quiet. That became for me a great event. A curious change came over me which I have always noticed in myself whenever anything has stirred my feelings. The flame and the moth seemed to go farther away and my mother's voice sounded strange and uncanny. I did not notice when she ended the fable. All my attention was fixed on the fate of the insect. I watched it with my whole soul. I gave to it my every thought. It had died a martyr to its illusions. As she put me to bed, my mother said, "See that you do not behave like the young moth. Don't become disobedient, or you may get burnt." As it did. I do not know whether I answered or not. I don't know whether I promised anything or whether I cried. But I do remember that it was a long time before I fell asleep. The story revealed to me things until then unknown. Moths no longer were, for me, insignificant insects. Moths talked, they knew how to warn. They advised, just like my mother. The light seemed to me more beautiful. It had grown more dazzling and more attractive. I knew why the moth circled the flame. The advice and warnings sounded feebly in my ears. What I thought of most was the death of the heedless moth. But in the depth of my heart I did not blame it. My mother's care had not had quite the result she intended. Years have passed since then. The child has become a man. He has crossed the most famous rivers of other countries. He has studied beside their broad streams. He has crossed seas and oceans. He has climbed mountains much higher than the Maki Ling of his native province, up to perpetual snow. He has received from experience bitter lessons, much more bitter than that sweet teaching which his mother gave him. Yet, in spite of all, the man still keeps the heart of a child. He still thinks that light is the most beautiful thing in creation, and that to sacrifice one's life for it is worthwhile. My childhood impressions. One of numerous rough drafts evidently written for practice. Published as Mi Primer Recuerdo, in El Renacimiento. Manila, February 2, 1908. I spent many hours of my childhood down on the shore of the lake Laguna de Bay. I was thinking of what was beyond. I was dreaming of what might be over on the other side of the waves. Almost every day, in our town, we saw the Guardia Civil lieutenant caning and injuring some unarmed and inoffensive villager. The villager's only fault was that while at a distance he had not taken off his hat and made his bow. The alcalde treated the poor villagers in the same way whenever he visited us. We saw no restraint put upon brutality. Acts of violence and other excesses were committed daily. The officers whose duty it was to protect the people and keep the public peace were the real outlaws. Against such lawbreakers, our authorities were powerless. I asked myself if, in the lands which lay across the lake, the people lived in this same way. I wondered if there they tortured any countryman with hard and cruel whips merely on suspicion. Did they there respect the home? Or over yonder also, in order to live in peace, would one have to bribe tyrants? The Spanish schools of my boyhood. From the introduction which Dr. Rizal put to his Spanish version of an article on the transliteration of Tagalog, his advocacy of the English style used in other Malay countries, as more akin to the genius of Filipino dialects, was considered extremely unpatriotic by most Spaniards. You perhaps attended a village Spanish school to learn your letters. Possibly, you have had to teach the letters in Spanish to others smaller than yourself. In either case, you must have noticed what I have, that children find great difficulty in mastering certain syllables. These are ca, ce, ci, co, ga, ge, gua, gui, etc. It is because Filipino children do not understand the reasons for such irregularities, nor do they know the cause for the changes in value of the sounds of certain consonants. In the old times, blows fell like rain. Many pupils were whipped every day. Sometimes the schoolmaster broke the ferule and sometimes he broke the children's hands. The first pages of their primers fell to pieces from long and hard use. The children cried. Even the monitors had to suffer at times. Yet those syllables which cost the children so many tears are of no use to them. Those syllables are necessary only in the learning of Spanish, which language in my time only 3 boys in 1,000 ever really learned. These 3 learned it in Manila, by hearing Spanish spoken, and by committing to memory book after book. I often wondered what was the use of learning it at all when in the end one spoke only Tagalog. But I kept my wonder to myself. I felt that to try to make reforms in the Philippines at that time would be to embark on a stormy voyage. After I grew up, I had to write letters in Tagalog. I was shocked at my ignorance of its spelling. I was surprised, too, to find the same word spelled differently in the different works which I consulted. This proved to me how foolish it was to try to write Tagalog in the Spanish way. The spelling in use today by all Filipino scholars is a great improvement over the old style. I want to place the credit for this change where it belongs. These improvements are due to the studies in Tagalog of Dr. Th. Pardo de Tavera alone. I have only been one of the most zealous champions of the change from the Spanish style. The Turkey that caused the Calamba land trouble. This account was given Captain Carnicero, the Spanish commander of the Dapitan district where Rizal was in exile, in 1892. My father was a friend of the owners of the Calamba estate. He was intimate, too, with the manager in charge of the plantation. Frequently, important visitors came to the plantation house. Then the manager asked my father for whatever he needed. He very often asked for a turkey, and my father gladly gave it to him. The poultry yard at our house was always full of turkeys because my father was a fancier of these fowls. But one season there came some epidemic and almost all the turkeys died. Only a few pairs, which were being kept for breeding, were left. Just at this time the manager one day sent for the customary turkey. Naturally my father had to tell the messenger that he had no turkeys to spare, because the greater part of them had died. This reply made the manager furiously angry. He wound up his abuse by saying, "You will pay for this in the end." A few days later my father received a note from the manager, saying that he was going to raise the rent on the land which my father occupied. He said the rent would be 1/3 more than father was then paying. The reason for this decision was clear. It was because my father had refused to give the manager the turkey. The proof of this was that no other tenant received any such notice. Father paid this increase on the day set, without a single word of protest, being among the first to pay. But after a few months, there came another note. In it the manager gave notice that the rent would be doubled. This, he said, was because my father was growing rich from the rented land where he had installed machinery for making sugar. My father could not pay this price. Then he was summoned to appear in court, and finally the alcalde ordered him to leave the land. So he lost his houses and machinery, all because of a turkey. From Japan to England across America. From letters written en route to his friend Mariano Ponce and first published in Manuel Artigas' Biblioteca Nacional Filipina. Manila, June, 1910. On February 28, 1888, I arrived in Yokohama. A few moments after reaching the hotel, I received the card of the official in charge at the Spanish legation. I had not even had a chance to brush up when he called. He was very pleasant and offered to assist me in my work. He even invited me to live at the legation, and I accepted. If, at the bottom, there was a desire to watch me, I was not afraid to let them know all about myself. I lived at the legation a little over a month, and traveled in some of the nearby provinces of Japan. At times, I was alone, at others, with the Spanish official himself, or with the interpreter. While there, I learned to speak Japanese, and made a slight study of the Japanese theater. After many offers of employment, which I refused, I sailed at last for America, about April 13th. On the steamer, I met a half-Filipino family, the wife being a mestiza, the daughter of an Englishman named Jackson. They had with them a servant from Pangasinan. The son asked me if I knew Rizal, the author of Nali Me Tangerine. Smiling, I answered that I did, and as he began to speak well of me, I had to make myself known and say that I was the author. The mother paid me compliments, too. I made the acquaintance of a Japanese who was going to Europe. He had been a prisoner for being a radical and editor of an independent newspaper. As the Japanese spoke only Japanese, I acted as interpreter for him, until we arrived in London. During this voyage I was not seasick. I visited the larger cities of America, where I saw splendid buildings. The Americans have magnificent ideals. America is a homeland for the poor who are willing to work. I traveled across America, and saw the majestic cascade of Niagara. I was in New York, the great city, but there everything is new. I went to see some relics of Washington, that great man whom I fear has not his equal in this century. I embarked for Europe on the City of Rome, said to be the second largest steamer in the world. On board, a newspaper was published up to the end of the voyage. I made the acquaintance of many people. They wondered at my taking about with me a foreigner who could not make himself understood. The Europeans and Americans were astonished to see how I got along with him. I could speak to everyone in his own language and understand What he said? My deportation to Dapitan. First published in the Biblioteca Nacional Filipina, Manila. The account was secretly sent by Rizal to his friends very shortly after his arrival at his place of exile. The reference to the school is from a letter to Dr. Blumentritt. I arrived in Manila the 26th of June, 1892. It was on a Sunday. At 12 o'clock, noon. A number of carbineers, including a major, met me. A captain and a sergeant of the Guardia Veterana were there in civilian clothes. I disembarked with my luggage, and they inspected it at the custom house. From there, I went to the Orient Hotel. I occupied room number 22, which overlooks the Binondo Church. That afternoon, at 4, I presented myself to His Excellency, Governor-General Despujol. He told me to return at 7 in the evening and I did so. He granted my petition for the liberty of my father, but not for the liberty of my brother and sisters. He told me to return on Wednesday evening at 7:30. From there, I went to see my sisters. First I saw my sister Narcissa. Afterwards Nanan, Saturnina. On the following day, Monday, at 6 o'clock in the morning, I was at the railway station, bound for Bulacan and Pampanga. I visited Malolos, San Fernando, and Tarlac. On the return I stopped at Bacolor, reaching Manila on Tuesday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 7:30 on Wednesday saw me with His Excellency. But not even then did I get him to revoke the deportation decrees. Still he gave me hope for my sisters, as it was the festival of Saints Peter and Paul. Our interview ended at 9:15. I was to present myself on the following day, at the same hour. That day, Thursday, we spoke on unimportant matters. I thanked him for having revoked the order to banish my sisters and told him that my father and brother would come by the first mail steamer. He asked me if I wished to return to Hong Kong and I answered, yes. He told me to come again on Wednesday. Wednesday he asked me if I persisted in my intention of returning to Hong Kong. I told him that I did. After some conversation he said that I had brought political circulars in my baggage. I replied that I had not. He asked me who was the owner of the roll of pillows and petates with my baggage. I said that they belonged to my sister. He told me that because of them he was going to send me to Fort Santiago. Don Ramon Despujol, his nephew and aide, took me in one of the palace carriages. At Fort Santiago Don Enrique Villamer, the commander, received me. He assigned me to an ordinary room containing a bed, a dozen chairs, a table, a washstand, and a mirror. The room had 3 windows. One, without bars, looked out on a court, another had bars, and overlooked the wall and the beach, the third served also as a door and had a padlock. 2 artillerymen were on guard as sentinels. They had orders to fire on anyone who tried to make signs. From the beach, I could not talk with anyone except the officer of the guard, and I was not allowed to write. Don Enrique Villamer, the commander of the fort, gave me books from the library. Each day the corporal of the guard proved to be a sergeant. They cleaned the room every morning. For breakfast, I had coffee with milk, a roll, and coffee cake. Lunch was at 12:30, and consisted of 4 courses. Dinner was at 8:30, and was similar to the lunch. Commander Villamer's orderly waited on me. On Thursday, the 14th, about 5:30 or 6 p.m., the nephew notified me that at 10 o'clock that night I should sail for Dapitan. I prepared my baggage, and at 10 was ready, but as no one came to get me, I went to sleep. At 12:15, the 8 arrived with the same carriage which had brought me there. By way of the Santa Lucia gate, they took me to the Malecon, where were General Ahumada and some other people. Another 8 and 2 of the Guardia Veterana were waiting for me in a boat. The Cebu sailed in the morning at 9. They gave me a good stateroom on the upper deck. Above the doors could be read Chief. Next to my cabin was that of Captain Delgras, who had charge of the party. 10 from each branch of the military service were in the party. There were artillery, infantry of the 70th, 71st, 72nd, 73rd, and 74th. Regiments, carbineers, cavalry, and engineers, and Guardia Civil. Of artillerymen there were at least 12. We were carrying prisoners loaded with chains, among whom were a sergeant and a corporal, both Europeans. The sergeant was to be shot because he had ordered his superior officer, who had misbehaved while in Mindanao, to be tied up. The soldiers who obeyed orders and tied the officer up were given 20 years imprisonment, and the officer himself was dismissed from the service because he had let them tie him up. I ate in my stateroom, the food being the same as the officers had. I always had a sentinel and a corporal on guard. Every night, Captain Delgras took me for a promenade on deck till 9 o'clock. We passed along the east coast of Mindoro and the west coast of Panay. We came to Dapitan on Sunday, at 7 in the evening. Captain Delgras and 3 artillerymen accompanied me in a boat rowed by 8 sailors. There was a heavy sea. The beach seemed very gloomy. We were in the dark, except for our lantern, which showed a roadway grown up with weeds. In the town we met the governor, or commandant, Captain Ricardo Carnicero. There was also a Spanish ex-exile, and the practicante, Don Cosma. We went to the town hall, which was a large building. My life now is quiet, peaceful, retired and without glory, but I think it is useful too. I teach reading, Spanish, English, mathematics, and geometry to the poor but intelligent boys here. Moreover, I teach them to behave like men. I have taught the men how to get a better way of earning their living, and they think I am right. We have begun, and success is crowning our trials. Advice to a nephew. Written from Dapitan. Rizal took great interest in the education of his sister's children, and in Germany had made for them a translation into Tagalog of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. This he embellished with many appropriate drawings and wrote out very plainly, making a book of 80 pages. I think that I ought to mention to you a slight error which I have noticed in your letter. It is a little error which many in society make. One should not say, I and my sisters greet you, but my sisters and I greet you. Always you have to put yourself last. You should say, Emilio and I, you and I, my friend and I, and so on. For the rest, your letter is well written. In it you express your thoughts clearly. You use only the necessary words, and your spelling is good. Keep on advancing. Learn, and think much about what you learn. Life is a very serious matter. It goes well only for those who have intelligence and heart. To live is to be among men, and to be among men is to strive.